welcome. For those of you who are new, you are at a Morbid Anatomy event. We do events like this every Monday night and often on weekends. My name is Joanna Ebenstein. I'm the creative director and founder of Morbid Anatomy. And I run Morbid Anatomy with my colleagues, Leticia Barbier and Christina Preda. That's not her last name anymore. She has a married name and I can't remember, Lo siento. So I want to tell you about a few more events we have coming up, just in case you're interested. On Monday, which is tomorrow night, we have a talk by Liz Andres, who is our resident mythologer, in-house mythologer, I would say. She's given a number of talks on mythology and culture, and her talk on Monday, tomorrow, will be on Medusa and the horror of the Gorgon. On Easter, well, to celebrate Easter, on Monday, April 18th, we're going to have a talk called The Foreskin of Jesus Christ, the Church's Strangest Relic in Italy's Oddest Town by David Farley. You can find out more about these talks on our website. I'll put the link in the chat a little bit later. And for those of you in the New York area or on the East Coast, I want to let you know that our Morbid Anatomy library, which has many of the sources that we've used to create this organization, many of the books we've used for writing books and for all the research we've done, are available free of charge at the Morbid Anatomy Library every Saturday at Industry City. And on April 30th, we'll be having an open house with a flea market and an after party entirely free. I'll put the link in the chat as well. Hope you can join us for that. I also want to tell you that you might notice we're recording this talk. We record most of our talks and archive them on our Patreon. We have about 150 now, and for $5 a month, you can have access to our entire backlog of talks, along with virtual tours of cemeteries and museums around the world, and articles by our staff as well as guest writers. So I will put the link in the chat. I hope you'll check that out. And finally, what I want to say is tonight's talk is actually the launching off of a class that tonight's speaker will be teaching for Morbid Anatomy starting on June 9th, which is called A Cultural History of Robots. And I will put a link to that in the chat as well. I hope you will check it out. So what I'd like to do is introduce today's speaker and just so you know a little bit more about him before we get started. Today's speaker is Jason Lahman. He is an American visual artist, sculptor, poet, and cultural historian. And his research and teaching work have focused primarily on the advent of modernity and its radical transformation of the human relationship to technology and how this has impacted the human sense of self. He has an MA in modern European history with an emphasis in the history of science and technology, and is formerly a lecturer in the humanities at San Francisco State University. Today, he's based in Portugal, which is why he has that beautiful background behind him. And I hope you will join me in welcoming today's speaker, Jason. Welcome, Jason.
Hello, everyone. Joanna, the sound was going in and out there for a second, so I hope we're okay. But you'll let me know if we're not.
I'll let you know.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you, everyone, for coming. This is my first time actually lecturing on Zoom, so I hope you'll be patient with me. And it's been a while since I've presented this information, but it is truly one of my favorite topics. And I'm so delighted to be working with Morbid Anatomy. It's just a real thrill. I've been a big fan of their work for a long time. And I'm also delighted that we will be doing a 7-week class, class version of this entire talk. So the cultural history of robots from myth to modernity will start in the end of June. And so hopefully this lecture will give you a little taste for all of the great things that are coming down the pike. So why robots? I ask myself that, sort of consistently. I'm not terribly interested in contemporary robots, although I think sometimes that's just because they're so ubiquitous, and so much of our life now is actually intertwined with all kinds of artificial intelligence. And the robots of today very often are things that we can't even see. It wasn't always the case. And so I think because I'm a visual artist and because I have a background in the visual arts, understanding how some of these older technologies are also tied into craft and performance and all of these things that we tend to think of as being more of the plastic arts, I think might be one of the reasons that I have always been sort of attracted to this idea. So I started doing this research about 15 years ago when I was doing my master's. And little by little, I started to realize that I had so much information that it really needed to be a course. And about 10 years ago, when I was still living in San Francisco, I taught the course. And it was really, really a wonderful experience to see how people that weren't even necessarily interested in technology or in robots all of a sudden found that they were thinking about technology and they were thinking about robots in a new way. So that was quite edifying. So let's get started. So what is a robot? Well, as I've said, we're going to be looking at things mostly before the 20th century. And so we are going to be using a much older word, automata, plural. Well, that's the plural. The singular is automaton. And that comes from the Greek for self-moving, that which moves of its own accord or by its own will. And when we are talking about the history of automata, I want to just very quickly kind of go over what are we talking about when we are talking about the history of automata. Well, we're going to be talking about literary sources. So we're going to be talking about legends and myths and things in texts, but then we're also going to be looking at actual objects and then texts on technology. So the history of the robot is a history of speculative and legendary objects, as well as a history of actual artifacts. The history of robots includes the study of the technologies behind robot creation. So how did people in the past actually make these things, these ancestors of robots? And then I want us also to be thinking about the cultural uses and people's experiences with these objects, with these things, whether we're actually looking at primary sources that are talking about the actual experiences that people had with real things, or whether we're looking at sources that are talking about things that we would classify more as myths and legends. And then I also want us to be thinking about the robot as an analogy or as a metaphor used by philosophers, writers, and artists to think through ideas about what it means to be human, and what it means to be a human in relationship to something like a god or another type of entity that has perhaps greater power than you have. And then I think a question that I want us to be thinking about is, why did our ancestors make up stories about robots, automata? And also, why did they actually make these objects when they did make them? And I would say that it's as a way to understand the nature of the world and their place in it as human beings. But also, when we are looking at things like these spectacular automata at royal courts, it was a way to impress to impress others and to show the power of the person who owned them. And as we'll see, that is particularly related to religious ceremonies and also to ceremonies at royal courts where you're trying to impress someone. So another thing I want us to do is to bear in mind that these objects were witnessed and understood in very different ways by those who encountered them. And those who had access to the knowledge behind the actual making of these objects were often privy to secrets. So for example, when somebody was in a temple in the ancient world, or when someone was at some kind of a royal court as an ambassador or as a visitor, or at some type of a feast where one of these things would have made an appearance or was part of the decor, that person didn't always know what they were looking at. Some people did, some people didn't. And so as historians and as people who are looking at people in past times, in past places, in past situations, we need to be aware of that. And then the other thing that I want us to be aware of as we go through the history of automata is the role of craftspeople and engineers, because we also have to bear that in mind. Who was making these things? Where were they getting their knowledge from? And also who was paying for it? So again, where do we start with this? Well, I think we start with myths of creation. And as I was saying with Joanna when she was asking me if there were any particular images of the robot in contemporary culture that stuck with me, I think the film Ex Machina is a wonderful example of this very, very old concern. Who made us? How were we made? And why were we made, if we were made at all? And if we are to look at most of the creation myths found throughout the world, there is always some kind of an intelligence. Usually it's something like us, although much more powerful. And it is making us, usually not ex nihilo, usually not out of nothing. We are being made from a substance, and somehow we are being animated. So this is an early modern image of God in the Garden of Eden, creating Adam out of the mud. He's made out of the dust of the ground, as the Old Testament tells us, and God breathes into him. And so there's this idea, and you'll see this when we look at Hero of Alexandria's treatises on automata. When something is being brought to life, when it has been created, what is the force or the power or the thing that is animating it? And so in the creation myths, very often it's the breath of the deity, sometimes it's fire. If we look at the older Greek sources, there are several different creation myths. One that I find really interesting is the story of the Titan brothers, Prometheus and Epimetheus. And this is an image from one of my favorite children's books, Dulier's Book of Greek Myths, in which the Titan Epimetheus is setting a heart within the body of one of his creations, which happens to be a human being. Likewise, in a lot of the ancient Greek sources, the god Hephaestus, known to the Romans as Vulcan, is a creator of various types of beings. He's not a maker of human beings, but he is a maker of many different types of automata and artificial beings, and he brings them to life in different ways, sometimes with quicksilver, sometimes with very clever and magical mechanics. Another image from Dulier's Book of Greek Myths of Hephaestus, who was a lame god. As you remember, he was hurled to earth from heaven when he got between his parents, Hera and Zeus. I think they were having an argument. And so he fashioned for himself these two helpers who would help him get around his workshop. And there's a lot of other stories of the different types of creatures that he fashioned for various reasons. Now, if we're thinking about things like the fembot, this image of a female automaton that very often is kind of a Trojan horse for nefarious ends, this entity goes back a long way. Pandora, or all gifts, is a creature that is created at the behest of Zeus to punish human beings. Here's an image from the 5th century BC of Pandora after she has been fashioned. I think that's Aphrodite, who's giving her a necklace to make her irresistible. You'll remember Pandora is a kind of a Trojan horse because she's coming to Earth. As I recall, she's given as a bride to Epimetheus to punish him. And she bears with her a jar filled with ills, the ills of the world. And so when she opens that, all of the bad things that are to plague human beings for the rest of their time on Earth come out of that. And I was reminded again, if we're thinking about the contemporary world, of this idea of the Trojan horse virus, right? So the thing that is not quite what it seems, it contains something that is the undoing of the receiver. A rather lovely image from the early 20th century, late 19th century, of the creation of Pandora. So here, Jupiter or Zeus is visiting the workshop of Hephaestus to survey the work. Another myth of a kind of a fembot, but also of the artificial human being. Although I don't think, if we're thinking about Pygmalion and Galatea, Galatea is necessarily an evil creature. But she is the representative of this idea that we find in Greek myth of this beautiful, non-living female that is brought to life. In this case, Pygmalion is the sculptor who falls in love with his own creation. And of course, he prays to the goddess of love, Aphrodite, Venus, and she looks upon him with favor and she grants this statue life. I was reminded again this morning by my husband of the George Bernard Shaw play, Pygmalion. Of course, that's what My Fair Lady is based on. And so this idea also of a male creator taking female clay, taking a female that he can impress his will upon and turning her into something else. The gendering of robots, the gender aspect of the automaton is so important in these early stories. I wanted to bring up, and I will talk more about this in the class, Freud had a student named Dr. Karen Horney, and she pushed back against the Freudian idea of penis envy. And she said, no, no, she said, we don't have penis envy. You men have womb envy. And so I think it's really something that we need to bear in mind, that the history of the automaton is very much the history of a man wanting to bring forth life in his own way without the help of a woman. Although in this case, the case of Pygmalion and Galatea, it is of course the great goddess Aphrodite that is actually animating the statue. So I want to pop over a little bit to Greek philosophy. This is a quote from Aristotle's Politics. There is only one condition in which we can we can imagine managers not needing subordinates and masters not needing slaves. This condition would be that each inanimate instrument could do its own work at the word or command, at the word of command or by intelligent anticipation, like the statues of Daedalus or the tripods made by Hephaestus. I love this line. As if a shuttle should weave of itself and a plectrum should do its own harp playing. So already in Aristotle, we have this idea, this desire that the slave or the servant could be replaced or be equaled by a machine that could actually do work. So that's the mythology. That's some of the philosophy, at least in the classical world, that's behind some of these ideas. Let's talk about the real objects. So there's an inventor known as Philo of Byzantium who lived in the 3rd century BC. And we know him, I believe it's through Persian manuscripts. We'll have to check on that to make sure that I'm accurate when I'm saying that. At any rate, we know him through a Middle Eastern transmission. And 2 of his automata, which have been recreated, are a wine pouring maid, and then this wonderful device driven by steam in which birds chirp. And a little owl will turn and look at them at a certain point and the birds will stop chirping. And so these hydraulic and steam-driven automata were something that we know was, were created in the ancient world. And it was Philo of Byzantium, and then I'm going to skip ahead here just for a second. Hero of Alexandria, a later scientist of about 200 years, who wrote down and actually created descriptions of how these types of things could be built. I want to back up here just a second. There is a gentleman by the name of Kostas Kotsanis, a contemporary gentleman in Greece, who runs a place called the Museum of Ancient Greek Technology. I have not been there, but he has recreated several of these ancient Greek machines. And you can go there and you can see actual functioning models of these things. And they're quite extraordinary. This is really worth mentioning. The Antikythera mechanism is an object that was dredged up out of the sea at the beginning of the 20th century. And it's very often spoken of as being the first computer. It's an object which these folks used to actually calculate specific lunar and other astronomical cycles. And it was also in relationship to these different sacred games that were held in Greece. And you can see recreations of it online and also very, very lengthy descriptions of how it worked. Now, historians had known or believed that they knew that the Greeks had actually created mechanisms like this to do really complex calculations, and they were things that had toothed gears. But it wasn't until the early 20th century that we actually had an object to prove it. And so now we do know that indeed, over 2,000 years ago, the Greeks were creating machines to do these very, very very complex types of calculations. So not quite an automaton, a self-mover, but something that was programmable. So again, back to Hero of Alexandria. I know one of our guests said that she has a keen interest in Hero. We have 2 of Hero's texts. These were preserved by Arab scholars in the Middle Ages and then later transmitted back to the West during the Renaissance. And something that's very interesting about Hero's descriptions is that they are types of theorems. So he's describing these really quite fantastical and fanciful machines that very often seem to have to do with temples, things like automatic doors, things like these very peculiar automatic altars that have little puppets that dance. Um, but what Hero is actually doing is he is trying to describe very specific types of physical properties. And so these are sort of like, these are books that are teaching us about physics, at least as it was understood at the time, and as teaching us about mechanics, at least his understanding of physics and mechanics. But we do believe that some of these things actually did operate in the contemporary temples of his time, and we have sources that talk about them. So, statues that would move, chariots that would hover above the floor. There's a long history, and we'll get into that in the class, of automata being used within the temples of Egypt, Roman Alexandria, and various places around the Mediterranean of the time to shock and to thrill those who were visiting the temples. This is a contemporary rendering of that altar, which was supposedly covered in either glass or horn. And through it, you could see these wonderful puppets as the thing turned, casting shadows. Here's probably one of Hero's most famous, I don't want to call it an invention, but something that he describes in his text, the automatic doors of a temple. And supposedly the light would be lit on the altar, the water would be heated within a hidden tank, and the doors would swing open at a particular time. And this was also accompanied by blasts of trumpets and things of that nature. And supposedly the worshipers would think that the god was pleased by the sacrifice. If you're interested in exploring this in detail, I would highly recommend Adrienne Mayer's book, Gods and Robots, which came out a few years ago. She goes into great detail on the mythology and also the ancient technology. So I want to bounce over quickly to ancient China. When I teach the class, we will be looking in depth at the automata of China and also Japan, classical India. I can't go into that with the greatest detail here because of time limitation, but I do want to mention a few things. There's a wonderful source from the 10th century BCE about an automaton that was created and used to fool one of the first emperors. And I won't read the entire primary source to you, but the emperor is first delighted by it and then terrified. And then the inventor, Yen Shi, allows the emperor to take it apart, and he can actually see how the thing functions. And of course, then that puts Yen Shi in his good graces. The description of this is that the object was made out of things like soft materials, so leather, bamboo, various bits of gut, things like that. So it's a kind of a cross between a musical instrument of some kind and then some kind of a puppet. Moving ahead about 1500 years, one of the actual automata, well, it's a water clock, but we'll call it an automata, in the Chinese world is this fabulous astronomical clock by Su Song. And again, the history of automata, of early robots, is inextricably tied into the history of clockwork. And clockwork as we know it comes a little bit later, but the early clocks, both of the Middle East and the ancient world, and also of the ancient Eastern countries such as China and Japan, were clepsydras. So these were clocks that ran on the force of running water. So Su Song's clock is the most famous of its time. It was used to measure, again, like the Antikythera mechanism, I won't say measure, to chart and to show forth representations of lunar, solar, and other types of astronomical cycles. And the robot component of it were a series of figures that would turn in accordance with these different cycles. If you find yourself in Japan, there is actually a full-scale recreation of Su Song's clock. and it's at the Gishodo Tsukawa Watch and Clock Museum. And again, if you're interested in this, you can Google to your heart's content, and the images of this thing are quite extraordinary. And there's also some wonderful recreations of the clock actually functioning, I should say, computer models of it. So let's keep on moving here in time and also in space. Al-Jazari is a name you should know. He is considered one of the great polymaths of the early Islamic world. And he wrote a text called the Book of Knowledge of Ingenious Mechanical Devices. And we're very lucky that it was copied so many times, both in his lifetime and after his death, because we have beautiful representations of what he was talking about in his work to be found throughout the world. This is one of his most famous designs. This is the elephant clock. And in Dubai, there's a wonderful scale recreation of it. Here's a few others. Al-Jazari claimed that he was not going to write about anything that he had not made himself or seen with his own eyes. And so one historian of technologist, Otto Mayer, has described this book as the first do-it-yourself manual. Because if you really understand what Al-Jazari is talking about, supposedly, you too can create some of these fascinating automata, particularly if you're being patronized by a fabulously wealthy person as he was. Here is a wine serving automaton and some kind of a fountain with a figure on it. These types of automata are related to the things that Heron is talking about. And so people like Al-Jazari in the Middle East, in the Middle Ages, knew about these technologies. They knew about these texts. And for a long time, people said, oh, they preserved the technology. Well, it wasn't just that they preserved it. They added to it, and they also had their own traditions, their own, let's call them indigenous traditions of creating these types of things. And the wonderful thing is in the last, I would say, 50 years, historians across the world are really working together to make sure that we start to understand the story of these other traditions. So when we think about the history of technology, when we think about the history of automata, we have to be very conscious of this idea of transmission, shared knowledge, things like the Silk Road. People were always coming and going, not only with stories, but sometimes with actual representations, with actual objects. In 807 AD, we have many sources that tell us that Harun al-Rashid, the Caliph of Baghdad, sent Charlemagne a gift. And it was this fabulous water clock. And so you're looking at these two representations, one from the Middle Ages, one from the 19th century, which show it as being this kind of small thing. And they're showing it that way because that's representative of what they themselves understood. But what we now know is it was probably much bigger than that. And it was probably one of these fabulous water clocks, the type that Al-Jazari mentions in his work. I find this very funny as we're thinking about how these things change over time in the way that they're represented. This is a late 19th century, early 20th century representation of this famous clock that was sent to Charlemagne. And as you can see here, the way that it's been represented is as a sort of a French parlor clock. Not accurate at all. This is what it probably looked like. This is a recreation by Ulrich Allards from an exhibit that was done a few years ago called Allah's Automata. And going back to Al-Jazari's text, the representation of an object that was probably very much what the Charlemagne clock looked like. So this is a water clock. And I'm going to show a very short video of an animation of this famous castle clock so you can get an idea of how it functioned. Bear with me on the sound, folks.
The hours since sunrise were shown by the open doors on the clock front, as well as by roundels that lit up the passage of time. The minutes were reflected by the progress of a crescent moon across the clock's frieze. At its top, a large dial mimicked the movement of the moon and stars across the sky as the sun rose and set. Within the clock, movements were regulated by a most ingenious system of reservoirs, troughs, and pulleys. Yet it was the smallest device, a cart that ran on a wooden track, that set off a dramatic chain of events leading to the telling of the time. The clock's central mechanism was a reservoir from which an accurately calibrated flow of water was allowed to seep into a float chamber and into a plate and spout. As a weighted float descended within the reservoir, it tugged at two pulleys, one that set the cart on its motion and another that slowly pulled a sphere, which in turn rotated a cut-out crescent disc to shine light from candles onto the roundels and shift the sun and moon dial on top of the clock. As the cart moved along its road, upon the hour, a vertical shaft triggered the upper and lower doors to reveal the figure of a man and the words, "Dominion is God's." When this happened, the gate on a rail behind the doors opened to release two balls, which travelled down chutes and into the beaks of two gold falcons, which then tilted and dropped the balls into two copper vases, announcing the hour with a clash of cymbals. At the same time, the water that had escaped from the reservoir was directed into troughs to restart the clock's mechanism. For 3 times in the day, a pulley unplugged a trough and the water flowed over a scoop wheel, driving camshafts which activated musicians in front of the clock, the drummers and cymbalists who beat their instruments, and 2 trumpeters whose music was made by the flute-like sound created by the expulsion of air through whistle jars. At the same time, the cart continued its hourly journey, setting off the magical elements of the castle clock.
So I'm going to stop it there. That'll give you an idea. And if you're interested in these Islamic water clocks, there are many videos online that will show you all of the details of how they function. But let's keep going on here. So, as I've said before, Charlemagne receives this gift. And if we start to look at the medieval sources, when the French Romance literature starts to flourish, there's a lot of exoticism in it, right? So there's stories of all of these knights who visit distant lands, and within these stories are references to automata. There's one that I find particularly lovely, where a knight is wounded and he's taken into an enchanted castle. And as he is recovering, on each of the 4 corners of his bed, there are these 4 automata. And what they are actually doing through the repetition of their motions is they're civilizing him. They're teaching him courtly behavior. Here's a couple of examples of Sir Lancelot facing copper men. So human figures that are made of metal, but which are animated. There's another tradition in the Middle Ages, and that is of a brass head, which is very often made by a sorcerer or a philosopher, very often through what we would now call science, right? Knowledge of the natural world. But very often it's also animated through astrological types of magic, or sometimes even demons. And what we have to remember when we're thinking about the history of natural philosophy at the time is that when people are writing about wonderful and inexplicable and sometimes exotic inventions, they very often are trying to categorize them. They don't quite know where the power of these things comes from. Is it coming from somebody who understands how to be in alignment with the powers of the intellect that God has given to us? Or have people been seduced by demons? So there's one object that I want to draw your attention to, which I think is really fascinating, and that's this head that, according to tradition, was made by Albertus Magnus, one of the great fathers of the church. And it is smashed by his student, St. Thomas Aquinas, because Aquinas is absolutely terrified that this thing is satanic. Well, in the image that I'm showing you, as you can see, it's being illustrated as a fraud. It is a bust with a speaking tube. And I want to go back in time a little bit here, because we now know this is a fact. We know that in the ancient world, there were statues in Egyptian and Greek temples that had speaking tubes. And so these things were sort of like puppets. So people would go in and offer sacrifice or make a query to these gods, and the thing would move and the thing would also speak. And so there is reference to this kind of fakery as the story of this brass head is told both in the Middle Ages and then later in time. Again, and I want to draw your attention to this, and we'll talk more about this in the class. The history of the automaton, the history of the robot, is a history of trying to figure out, what is this thing? Where does it get its power? Is it a trick or is it real? This is a quote from Jessica Riskin's wonderful article, Machines in the Garden, an article that's free online. I would urge you to download it if you're interested. She says this: early modern Europe then was alive with mechanical beings, and the Catholic Church was their main patron. The church was also a primary sponsor. I'm gonna just buzz through this because there's a few things that I really want to make sure that we get to. Riskin goes into great detail talking about how the Catholic Church sponsored so much of the recovery of this ancient engineering and technological knowledge for various reasons. But one of the main reasons was because this technology was very often incorporated into their own ritual and splendor. There are older traditions of automata in Europe that I would call indigenous, things that go back to before the recovery of this sort of ancient knowledge, things that go back to the Middle Ages and also to the Renaissance, things that are more puppet-like, but they start to merge in the Renaissance. I want to show you a couple of things that I think are really, really fun. And these have to do with the great church at Strasbourg, Our Lady of Strasbourg. The oldest extant robot in the world is the old rooster of the great clock of Strasbourg, and it's in the museum there. You can go see it. It's no longer functional. The great astronomical clock of Strasbourg was built in 3 different periods, in the 14th, 16th, and the 19th century. Here's an image from the 19th century where you can see a later version of it that has all of the fabulous astronomical dials. But there's also all of these incredible moving figures. Again, the moving figures that you're going to be seeing on the clock are not medieval. They're from the later periods of the clock, but they are representative of the types of things you would see on medieval clocks. There's a through line here. So here is death ringing his bell, and here is old age, and here is a young man. So you have the cycles of life, right? Something that's also really fun in the same church are these objects that are known in German as Rohraffen, the roaring apes. And again, these objects that you're looking at are not medieval, but there were medieval objects like these. Most of them are no longer extant. So you can see these Renaissance early modern figures. These are on the organ of this church, and they make sounds, and they're connected to the stops on the organ. So here's the Pretzel Man, and also here's Samson and the Lion, and these are all on the organ of the Church of Strasbourg. Here's some up close images showing you some of the mechanisms. I used to tell my students that, this is something that the Protestants were fighting against, was this type of moving imagery in churches. They weren't just pushing against, the idolatry of regular statues. They didn't like that. There was a tradition in the Catholic Church of very often churches and church festivals being very much like what we would now think of as fun houses. There were figures, and there were these rather spectacular, almost fairground types of experiences that people were having in church. Not always, but very often. And that was very offensive to people like Luther and to the Protestants who saw these things as being idols. This is another thing I want to draw your attention to in the history of automata in the Christian West, is that during the Protestant Reformation, there is a very strong pushback against images. And that's also because literacy is coming into being in a popular way. And so the history of automata as it's used by the church and as it was used in the ancient world, is a way to really wow, to really impress, and sometimes to terrify illiterate people. So a few more examples of the pretzel man. There's our Samson. Again, there's not a lot of extant examples of these were often left. So many of them were either removed or just, have come apart. Here's a detail of the organ here. Okay, this is from 1721, so again, not medieval and a little later, but I'm showing it to you because, again, in the High Middle Ages and in the Baroque period, these are the types of things that you would see in a Catholic church. Angels playing trumpets, bowing saints, leering devils, things ringing bells. I believe this is in Poland. So great fun. And why shouldn't church be fun? This is an example of an automaton from a little bit earlier period, but again, High Middle Ages. This is from the 14th century. The preacher placed it near him on his pulpit, and to impress his faithful parishioners, he emphasized sentences of his sermon by the grimaces of the figurine. So there are many cases of churches around Europe where let's call them puppets. They weren't necessarily automata being run by, steam or power. Foot pedal is more like it, right? So elaborate puppets that would very often be used to make a point. Here's an image of a pivoting angel from a church in Venice. There's a long tradition of having statues that would revolve on the tops of buildings. You hear about these things in the Islamic world too. Here's a very, very famous extant automaton, one that would be hand cranked. This is in a princely collection in Italy of a devil. In the High Middle Ages and also in the Baroque period, we have to remember that princely tables, tables of the people who could afford to throw great feasts, very often had automata or elaborate table fountains. Here are two examples. This is the only table fountain that we have left extant. This is the Cleveland table fountain. And again, this would have been run in a hydraulic way, and it would have been flowing with rose water or wine. And then a little bit later in the Baroque period, we have all of these princely tables that would have things called nefs, these wonderful wind-up automata that were very often in the shape of ships. These things were used for drinking games or very often to deliver presents to guests. Here's a quick animation of what this table fountain looked like when it was flowing with wine or rose water. And it had these bells on it so that it would make sounds. Table automata were very often a multi-sensory experience. So the smell, there would be the perfume smell either of the spiced wine or of the rose water, the sound of the bells. These people really wanted to wow their guests. This is one of my favorite images. This is a 19th century lithograph of a feast that took place actually in the 1400s. It was thrown by Philip the Good of Burgundy to actually raise funds and manpower for a crusade that he was going to wage, which never happened. And if you go online, Google Feast of the Pheasant Philip of Burgundy, and you'll get these ridiculous and amazing descriptions of this. Puppets, people baked into pies, automata of the strangest kinds, a dragon flying over the table and spewing fireworks at a certain point in the feast. Philip the Good of Burgundy was one of the wealthiest rulers of his time, and he had a castle called Hesdin or Edon. Sounds a little bit like Eden, and there's a history of playing on that because it had a fabulous garden. He had what we would now call a fun house in his castle at Edon, and it was filled with all kinds of really bizarre automata. And these were used to not just delight people, but also to terrify them and to humiliate them. There was a beautiful illuminated book, and when you looked into it, it would spit ink at you. There was a mirror you would look into, and then you would have flour dumped on you. There were these strange things. We don't quite know what they were. They were sort of humanoid formed things that would come out of cupboards and beat you. Very, very, very strange. But the funhouse quality of Philip the Good of Burgundy's bizarre house at Hesdin is quite fun to read about. Another image of one of these princely tables, and you can see here, this was for someone's wedding, things made out of sugar and marzipan, but also, objects that were very often moving. So a combination of automata and also puppets, I think. So if this is tickling your fancy, and I hope it is, you have to get a copy of Medieval Robots by Ellie Truitt. A wonderful read. And she gets into incredible things like the reanimation of corpses or the preservation of corpses with things like honey in a lot of these romances. Really, really good stuff. Let's keep moving. I see by the clock that time is growing short, and there's so much I just want to share with you. So we're through the Middle Ages, we're into the Renaissance, and I want to draw your attention to the ascent of the craftsmen, people like Leonardo da Vinci. He's just, of course, the most famous example, but there's so many others. So these men, and sad to say they were mostly men, who basically were, highly educated, but they were also, tough hustlers. And they were constantly presenting themselves to these, great warlords and aristocrats who could employ them. And the thing that they were being hired to do was to create these spectacular events, these royal noble events to wow subordinates. But also they were very often being employed to help with warcraft. So the history of engineering, the history of automata, the history of robots from the Renaissance up till now, and actually also if we think about the ancient world, it's true too, is very often spectacle and warcraft. And I think we can certainly draw parallels to that today. And again, because we're in the Renaissance, there's this incredible influx of this older knowledge flowing back into Europe. I love this. This is the images from the Bellicorum Instrumentorum, which was a book put together by Giovanni della Fontana. Anthony Grafton, the great Renaissance scholar, has written some wonderful stuff about this. And you're looking at examples of the Fire Witch and the Mechanical Devil. So these are things that Giovanni would probably have been presenting to one of these spectacular, aristocrat warlords for one of their feasts. But in this book, the Bellicorum Instrumentorum, and if you know Latin, you know that that means the instruments of war, there are all of these war engines. So it's, I can do this for you at your feasts and while you're subordinates. And also I can create these spectacular things that'll, knock the crap out of your enemies. Here is a recreation of one of Leonardo's most famous, something that he created for Francis, King Francis I of France. And according to one of the sources, it actually stood up on its hind legs, opened its chest, and a bouquet of blue lilies came out. I don't think that has been recreated in this particular example. But again, very often when we're reading these sources, we're getting different impressions of what these things looked like and what they did. But people are, over the last 50 years, have been trying to replicate these sorts of things. Another one, the automatic knight of Leonardo da Vinci. So some kind of an automaton knight that actually, I don't know if it stood up, but it did move. I think it was made for a grotto. Don't quote me on that, but there's a great book called Leonardo's Lost Robots, if you're interested, that goes into great detail. Juanello Turiano was an Italian-Spanish inventor who created a series of beautiful automata, and we have a number of them. He was also a hydraulic engineer and did some really incredible things for the city of Toledo, having to do with water sourcing for the city. This is his lute player, which I believe is now owned by the Kunsthistorisch in Vienna. Here's an image of her without her dress. You can see how she works. She would move across the table, and you can see the little feet. So again, you're probably starting to think these are starting to look like, the dolls that we have in the 20th century, and you're certainly correct there. These are very elaborate toys for very wealthy people. This is probably his most famous automaton. This is the Praying Monk. Again, if you're interested in this, a wonderful article called A Clockwork Prayer is easily available for download. This is owned by the Smithsonian, and you can see him in good working order on Vimeo or on YouTube. Just Google Praying Monk Smithsonian. He's about this high, and he would move across a table. So again, if we're getting to know these wonderful Renaissance and Baroque gentlemen who were bringing this incredible knowledge back to life, we should know about someone named Solomon de Caus. He was a Huguenot who was rather peripatetic because he was persecuted at various times in his life for his religious beliefs. But he moved all around Europe, creating really incredible and very elaborate automata for the gardens of the nobility. This is a hydraulic organ. There were these wonderful organs driven by water that would make music in a lot of these gardens. So here's two examples of those from a text by Solomon de Caus. You see the little bird on one. That's a reference back to these singing birds that you saw earlier in Philo and Huron's works. The mechanical bird has a long history, and you find it in the ancient world, you find it in the Middle East, you find it in China. Think of Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tale, which is set in China, about the nightingale. So the automaton in China have a long history, particularly the mechanical bird. Here's another image from the Solomon de Caus book of an automaton from a garden. Another extant automaton, a series of automata from the period. This is a little bit later. This is 1750, and this is still with us. This is a water-driven automaton town at Heilbrunn Palace outside of Salzburg. And the story behind that is quite fascinating. Again, if you're interested, a great book is Renaissance Fun, which just recently came out by Philip Stedman. And he gets into all of this, the wonderful entertainments, these great feasts, and also these gardens. So moving into the modern era, we often talk about René Descartes as being the father of this philosophical split between body and spirit. And that's of course true. It's more complicated than that, but it is true. And this is an image from his treatise on man, which is showing you the human being as some kind of a pneumatic machine. And if you know the treatises of Huron, you know, of course, that Descartes was looking at that. He was incredibly well educated by the Jesuits. And so his knowledge of mechanics and of the theories of hydraulics and of pneumatics was certainly a huge part of his thinking about how do living things work, right? Here's an image from 1680, again, also drawing on this diagrammatic history of living things. This is Giovanni Borelli's On the Movement of Animals. And I think simply from an aesthetic point of view, aren't they beautiful? Again, this whole idea of the universe as an automaton, the cosmos as a machine. There are references to it, of course, if we go back to the ancient world. I shouldn't say of course. There are references to it in the ancient world. And there are descriptions of things like Nero's dining room that had a moving ceiling set with gemstones to replicate the movement of the heavens. As I'm thinking about this, you could tell I'm getting excited. But, if we're looking at the early modern and the Enlightenment period, these types of objects, which are absolutely beautiful, are also merging with the sort of Antikythera type of object, right? So they're beautiful and they are representative of the heavens, but they are also calculational. They are also things that are highly, highly developed and that are ways of not just imagining what the universe is and how it's put together, but can actually be used to make calculations. So again, if we're getting back into the actual creating of artificial life, you all have to know about Jacques de Vaucanson, probably the greatest automaton maker of the 18th century. He made something called the defecating duck, which we no longer have. This is a photograph that was discovered in the 20th century. This was a photograph taken in the 19th century of this thing created in the 18th century. It was a duck that could supposedly eat grain and poop it out. We now know that it didn't actually digest. But Vaucanson wasn't doing this to fool people. And Jessica Riskin, the great historian of the robot, gets into this in her article, The Defecating Duck, which I would encourage you all to read if you're interested in this. What Vaucanson was trying to do was to actually create mechanical models of living bodies. And he really came up to bat when he created this flute player, which he did exhibit both to nobility and also to select members of the high bourgeoisie. His flute player actually played the flute. This was not a trick. He created an android that had a soft mouth, a tongue, and lips. And there were a series of bellows inside of it. And what he did was he studied an actual human flute player to understand how much air pressure actually had to be coming out of a person's mouth to make specific notes. And the details of what he had to come up with. Well, first of all, he had to understand how this actually was done pneumatically, but then he had to replicate it in machine form. And he did it. And we know he did it because it was taken apart and examined by people. It no longer exists, unfortunately. A little bit later, but the same century, you have Pierre-Jacques Droz and his family. And we have three of the automata that the Jacques Droz family created. One writes, one draws, and one plays the piano. Here is the image of the backs of these objects. They are, I think it's every Sunday, once a month, you can actually go see them. They're at a museum in Neuchâtel in Switzerland. They're in perfect working order. Here's a close-up detail of the hands. One of the piano player and the other one, well, I think these are actually both the fingers of the piano player. The keyboardist, we'll call her, it's not actually a piano. Here is a print from the late 18th century that the Jacques Droz family used to promote itself. They were also great watchmakers. I want to talk about a shift that happened in this period of time with automaton makers in Europe, automata makers in Europe. These gentlemen were highly skilled. These things took a lot of time and care to create. And so the type of person that could pay for something like this would, of course, have to be an aristocrat. And so the Jacques Droz were also clock and watchmakers. A lot of these people were, most of them are, in fact. And so the creation of really elaborate timepieces and automata could only come about through royal patronage. So sometimes they would create these things and then take them on tour and then hope a royal or a noble person with a lot of money could take them on as a patron. And there's a shift that's happening in the 18th and the early 19th century with who's paying for these things. We'll talk about that in a minute. But let's just stay with the artisan making these things for the nobility. So here we have an example, again, of the Jacques Droz taking their stuff around to show it to the high bourgeoisie and also to the nobility. Another person who was doing this was a gentleman by the name of David Röntgen. This is a very famous automaton, which you can still see in Paris at the Museum of Decorative Arts. And she actually plays the dulcimer. This was given to Marie Antoinette and to Louis XVI in 1784. And here she is actually playing. Notice the eye movements and the head movements. In the sake of time, I'm going to cut this short, but I want you to notice the head movements and the eye movements. That's really important. Bear with me, folks. I'm going to jump ahead here. Oh, I guess I cut that slide out. Well, I'll just tell you. It's important to notice the head and the eye movements, and you will see them also in the automata created by the Jacques-Drol's family. It's important because something is occurring where and Adelaide Voskuil in her book, Androids in the Enlightenment, gets into this. We are moving into a period of sensibility. And so the people who were creating these objects wanted you to really feel that they were human. And Voskuil gets into, she brings this up in her book, into the study of affect. There was a lot of writing going on in the time in philosophy about the human body and also about the presentation of the self, particularly about musicians and the way that they were to hold themselves when they were performing. There was a particular way in order for you to come across as a noble human being that you had to operate. Very similar if we're thinking about that older example of the knight in bed being taught by these automata how to be courtly, how to be civilized. Likewise, musicians of the time, particularly women, were being inculcated with ideas of how to move, how to hold themselves, because in natural philosophy at the time, and this is also has to do with theories about art and performance, there was this idea that you had to project something very particular to your audience in order to get them to really get into the feeling, in order to communicate what you wanted to communicate with them as an aware, sensitive human being, right? So just bear with me. So those type of movements, the neck, the eyes, Adelaide Voskuil argues that that's also a part of the programming of these machines. A little bit arcane, but I think there's something fascinating to it. We're not going to have time to talk about this today, but a lot of you know about the uncanny valley concept. So it's worth thinking about if we're creating a machine to be human and to pass the Turing test, right? To fool us, to get us to really have a relationship with it as if it's real and really alive, then there's something that machine has to pull off. It has to pull off a particular type of affect. And she argues that that's part of what these machines in the Enlightenment, particularly these performing female machines, are being programmed to do. I think it's a fabulous theory, and I think it's something that's very, very fruitful. Well, let's keep moving here. I'm going to go another probably 15 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have some time for some questions. But I really do want to push through to the end here because I just think there's a lot of really, really important stuff to talk about. So the shift that's occurring in Europe and also in North America, as we can talk about North America being a place where these things are being seen, and they are to a degree. These types of objects, these automata, these showpieces, are starting to move into a more bourgeois exhibition-based society, right? So people like David Röntgen, people like Vaucanson, people like the Jacques-Drol's, there's a tradition of making these objects for the elites, and that's starting to shift. So people are now this is after the American and French Revolution, ordinary people, middle-class people, not always middle class, but people who are out and about and part of the public sphere starting to see these things. Here's an example from 1826, the automaton exhibition at Gothic Hall. The automaton is starting to enter the popular imagination. And of course, we can't talk about the history of robots without talking about the chess-playing Turk. I don't have time to go into it. It was a fake, but it certainly fooled a lot of people for a very long time. It was made in 1770 for the court of the Empress Maria Theresa, and it ended up in the United States and was destroyed in a fire I think it was destroyed in the United States in 1854. Don't quote me on that, but I do know that it was destroyed in 1854. There's a gentleman down in Los Angeles, I can't remember if it's the magician Ricky Jay or not, but who has replicated it. And again, thanks to Google, you can see examples of that. But the chess playing Turk is really important because it's playing into this idea, which E.T.A. Hoffman and Poe will both be playing with. Is the automaton that you're seeing real? Is it a fake? Is the person you're falling in love with a real, or are they a fake? It certainly comes up in the Tales of Hoffman. And again, Tom Standish has written an absolutely wonderful history of the Turk, a quick, juicy read, which follows the whole life cycle of this object. I highly recommend it. Here's an example of Jean-Eugène Robert Houdin, one of the great stage magicians of the 19th century, but also one of the great automaton clockmakers of the 19th century. And so in him, we see an example of somebody who shares in the lineage of these earlier savants, but who also is a showman for the public. And he's very often showing his automata as a part of his magic shows on the stage, right? And there's a difference now in the 19th century. People who are coming to these wonderful shows in Paris and London and New York or wherever they're being shown, and these things are very often going on tour to smaller cities as well. They know what they're seeing is a machine. They know what they're seeing is a magic trick. They don't know how it's being done, but they know that it's not a demon animating it. And so there's this very interesting shift happening in magic. And that is that we as the public can enjoy magic. We as the public can enjoy automata. But we know, even if we're not privy to the technology, that it is being done through a technology that if we had the knowledge, we could also participate in, right? Automata in the 18th and the 19th century are doing this very fascinating thing where they are still being created for elites. You see the beautiful elephant clock by Henri Martinet, but they're also being created for these new captains of industry and for the very wealthy bourgeoisie. Here's a beautiful example of Gustave Vichy's famous Pierrot writing. And I know many of you, along with me, follow the wonderful House of Automata on Instagram. They are specialists in the rescuing and in the restoration of these exquisite 19th century gems. So again, the markets of automata are something that are really interesting when we're thinking about the history of these things. One thing I want to bring up, and I'll talk more about this in the class, is that in the 18th century and also a little bit earlier, there is a luxury market of automata to China from France and particularly England. And if you visit, I think it's in Beijing, there's an incredible hall of clocks and automata in which a lot of these fabulous 18th century and also Chinese objects of the 18th century are stored. Well, as we're moving very quickly through the 19th and into the 20th century, automaton and its relationship to the machines of industry is certainly being shown forth. And Simon Schaffer, along with many other historians, have pointed out the fact that people like Babbage, you know, he and Ada Lovelace create one of the first programmable computers. Babbage knows some of these automaton makers in the 18th century. He knows them personally. And when he comes into his own wealth, he actually collects them and even restores them. There's a great story of Babbage throwing a salon and the Silver Dancer, which is one of these magical automata made in the 18th century, which he has rescued and been and restored, is in one parlor, and his difference engine on which he is collaborating with Ada Lovelace is in the other. So you have the automaton body in one room and you have the automaton mind in the other. I wanted to share that because I just think it's such a great story. Here's a really fun early 19th century image, the March of Intellect. And as you can see, intellect, the monster of intellect, is being portrayed as an automaton made up of all kinds of things. In the history of robotics, in the history of technology, and in the imagination of how we think about the automata, in the 19th century, there's something happening in medicine, there's something happening in technology, right? We're moving into the age of steam. And that's, well, let's start thinking about artificial bodies as being steam driven. And while we're at it, let's explore the idea that bodies are also driven by steam and by heat. I want to point out The Steam Man of the Prairies, which is a dime store novel that inspires a lot of speculative fiction in the United States. I'm sure L. Frank Baum, if you look at the image, saw this, and that's probably where TikTok comes from. Here's a postcard of an actual automaton made in the 19th century, I think in the United States, based on this model. I also want to point out that in the history of technology and technology studies, there's this persistent push to think about technology in terms of evolution. That's highly problematic. We'll go into that in the class, but it's there, and it's still there, particularly in Silicon Valley. Well, certainly as we're moving forward in time, the human automaton, human machine, industrial machine, worker, the stories of all this are becoming deeply, deeply intertwined. And this is also when the concept of the human being becoming a kind of automaton is entering the imagination. Here's an image of workers in a button factory, punching out buttons hour after hour after hour after hour. The repetitive motion of the human being in these factories starts to enter the imagination of how writers and philosophers and everyone is thinking about the automated, automatic body. And the other thing that's starting to happen is this idea of the evolution of machinery, because in the 19th century, machines are changing so quickly and becoming so much more elaborate and doing so much. They're increasing the capacity of industry, right? To create so much more, to do so much more, to move us through space so much more quickly and over such long distances. And yet these machines don't look human. They're these very strange, almost alien things. And so that's something that's certainly coming into the imagination. Here's an image of Machine Hall at the Great Exhibition of 1851. The public, more and more in the middle of the 19th century, particularly at these great exhibitions held in the United States and Europe, are seeing these enormous mechanical things. This is from Darwin Among the Machines by Samuel Butler. His novel Erewhon is so important in the history of thinking about automata. We refer to the question, what sort of creature man's next successor in the supremacy of the earth is likely to be? We have often heard this debated, but it appears to us that we are ourselves, creating our own successors. We are daily adding to the beauty and delicacy of their physical organization. We are daily giving them greater power and supplying by all sorts of ingenious contrivances that self-regulating, self-acting power, which will be to them what intellect has been to the human race. In the course of ages, we shall find ourselves the inferior race. And if you've just watched Devs, or if you read Yuval Harari's a sequel to Sapiens, Homo Deus, well, we're going to be ending this talk by thinking about the Great War. And as I said, because the word robot is coined in 1920, I think this is a good place to kind of end this sort of prehistory of robots. The Great War changes everything because death is automated. The machine gun, the tank, all of these incredible inventions that have come forth in the late 18th and the 19th century come to a head on the battlefield. And of course, they come to a head in the damaged and mangled body. For the first time, all of these men are coming home from war, mangled and destroyed and mutilated. And that's, of course, feeding into the images that the Dadaists are creating, the futurists, So many of the great art movements in Europe in the early 20th century are being fed by this image of what has been done to the body. Here's an image of from Otto Dix showing this, people who have survived the war and who now have components of the body that are artificial. So we're going to be ending this by, of course, talking about the father of the robot. And I hope I'm saying his name correctly, Karl Čapek. I'm sure our Czech friends or those who know better will correct me on this. But of RUR, Rossum's Universal Robots, is written in 1920, is performed in 1921, and is soon translated into 30 languages and makes an absolute sensation as it is performed across the world. And if you haven't read it, I would urge you to read it. It's a quick read and it's wonderful. The robots themselves are not made of metal. They're androids, and they're made of wetware. Here's an image from an early production. And of course, as you all probably know, the robots rebel and destroy their creators. How could they not? They're intelligent. They don't want to live as slaves. Equally important in the history of early robotics is, of course, Metropolis. I'm sure most of you have seen it. Although I used to live in San Francisco, and so it seemed that every year at the Silent Film Festival at the Castro Theater, there was always a new version of Metropolis making its debut. They had discovered an extra 10 minutes. It seems to go on forever. It's a strange film. It's kind of a hot mess, but it's also so important because all of these things that we've been talking about in the history of robotics are there. Labor, the fembot, the occult. A lot of people have been commenting on the pentagram in the laboratory of Rotwang. Well, of course, he's a sorcerer of a kind. And of course, those incredible images of the industrial workers acting like robots. Of course, it ends in revolt with the destruction of the machines. Let's go out on a high note here, then we'll open it up for questions. I know I've gone a little too long here. A wonderful image. This is the Japanese robot, walking robot Asimu, delivering flowers to a memorial for Karl Čapek when the Japanese ambassador visited the Czech Republic in 2003. I find this very moving and very beautiful. So Joanna, if we want to open this up to questions.
Yeah, you've already got a bunch of questions, but before I start reading them, I'm just going to repeat to everyone.
That was a lot. I want to apologize to anybody who feels like I blew a gasket or they blew a gasket.
I don't think any apologies are necessary. I think the range of what you did is really incredible. As someone who's looked at this topic a little bit, I think you did a great job of kind of just tying it all into one narrative, which is not easy. You have a lot of comments, people saying how much they enjoyed the talk, and I'm going to put again a link to the chat in the chat to the speaker's upcoming class if you want to go deeper into this. Great. And that makes me think one of the first things that someone commented on, which I'll bring up to you, is it was Sarah who asked if it might be possible to put together a book recommendation list. And if you could do that.
Yes.
So if you'll all look in your inboxes in the next, probably early next week, we'll be sending out a link to rewatch this talk, and I'll put the list of books on the Patreon page where we put your talk. So,
and you know, folks, I'm happy if anybody has particular questions after this. I'm happy to answer any questions because yeah, I've been collecting data for 15 years on this, so a lot.
Okay, we have a few specific questions already. So Altia says, modern people are used to small mechanisms and clocks. How big were these automaton objects? I imagine them quite large, but I can barely figure it in my mind.
It's hard. Yes, the size thing is very, very confusing sometimes. If we're thinking about Al-Jazari's objects, these things were big because they were driven by water. And very often, like in these royal courts, if we're talking about, because we're talking about things like clocks, and then we're talking about, you know, automata, very often they're connected. The figures on clocks would sometimes just be like large dolls, or if, you know, it's a big clock, they can be life-size. The things in Strasbourg are pretty small. They're like dolls. But the water clock stuff, that's usually much larger. So it just depends. It depends on where we are and when we are. The things in the gardens of the aristocracy were usually not all that large.
Okay, great. We've got a few more questions here. And again, I'm going to ask others to put your questions in the chat. Okay, so Shane actually has a question about your class.
Yeah.
In your class, do you speak on AI assistant personalities like Siri and Alexa / their historical counterparts?
Yes, and that's work that I'm actually doing right now. The last week, we're going to be looking at antecedents to a lot of this stuff. It's not where I've put my focus in the past, but I feel that it needs to be now. So yes.
Okay, we have another question about the class. Kathleen says, I see classes recorded so we can watch it later if I can't make the live session. Is recorded. Yeah. The recording is available, Kathleen, forever, essentially. We have never taken a class off of Vimeo yet, so don't worry about that. So we have a few more questions. Thomas Sheffield says, do you have any information on the Wicked Thief or any more information on the Wicked Thief automata? I think I heard about it on the History Channel years ago, but haven't been able to find out any more about it since.
And that's from Thomas?
That's from Thomas Sheffield, yeah.
Thomas, I would say look up the Rood of Grace in Boxley, Kent, K-E-N-T. That's a similar object that we have actual primary source material about. The Protestants destroyed it, but it's a similar type of thing. I don't know anything more about the Wicked Thief, but the Rood of Grace of Boxley, Kent is the most well-documented object that's like that. It was a puppet.
Okay, we've got another question. We have another question from Kathleen who says, I found this really interesting as well. Have you found any documentation of automatons in ancient / history of African nations or some of the nations of South America, such as the Mayans and the Aztecs? I know a lot of documents have been destroyed way back, but I'm wondering if anything may have come to light in recent times.
That is an excellent point. It was running through my head last night. So I don't know because I haven't done the research. And I truly hope that's something I will know about in coming time, because this is truly a global thing. And obviously you can see the Western bias, certainly in my presentation. That's because I'm a historian of Europe. But it also just reflects the biases of the academy. This type of work is exploding right now. So what I would say to you is we need to do that work. And so I don't know, but I'm sure it's there.
Okay, great. I don't see any more questions. I'm going to give people just a minute or two. And while we're waiting to see if any more questions come in, I have a question for you. Why do you think, I was really struck by your comment that you showed that beautiful church piece that had all of those fun, amazing, over-the-top elements.
The Polish organ?
Yes. And you were talking about how less fun church has gotten. And here, I live in Mexico where,
yes.
You know, church is a lot more fun. Basically, mariachis are seen as appropriate for churches. And when I spoke to a nun about that, she was saying, why? Why is it seen as inappropriate in the US? It's like, I'm not sure. What do you think?
Historical.
Is it the Enlightenment? Is it?
Yeah, well, no, it's not the Enlightenment, it's the Puritans. This is also why color. I mean, this is something else that I focused a lot on when I was teaching and also when I was doing my historical work. It's like, why in the United States do, this whole idea of color and this whole idea of, somebody once said, what the definition of Puritanism is the fear that somebody somewhere might be having a good time. It has to do with the Protestant Reformation, and particularly it has to do with the Puritans. They closed down the theaters. It's a very radical and very different reinterpretation of what worship is and what it should entail. It also has to do with the rise of literacy. The privileging of text, particularly you reading the text yourself, over the image.
Right.
Yeah, I live in Portugal now, and I have to tell you, it's a thrill to go into a church or a cathedral and to see pipe organs that have satyrs and mermaids on them.
Wow, incredible.
Yeah. And they're Christian,
Yeah.
These are just as Christian as anyone else.
Okay, that's brought up a few more questions. So Noel says, I'm wondering how Christian bodily epistemology, parentheses, Father / Son, Holy Spirit, human / Son, or flesh versus soul, shapes belief about automata in Europe.
At what time? I think we have to talk about when. Sorry to be
Noel, can you give us a time period? And in the meantime, I'll ask, so Valeria says she's interested in learning more about the fear of technology. Will that be something you cover in the class?
Technophobia. I think certainly as it relates to automata or to robots. Yeah.
Okay, well, we're waiting for Noelle to type in her response.
Sorry, Noel. In order to answer it, I'd like to just.
Yeah, she says medieval, but also arguably through the Renaissance.
I think it would have to do with representation, because automata in the Middle Ages and in the Renaissance are usually they're usually illustrative. They're illustrative of two things. They're illustrative of the teachings of the church, Bible stories. Think about things, and it's often connected to puppetry. So even in these religious parades, you'll have the Hellmouth with Adam and Eve dancing around. You'll have this automata in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance are automatic theater in a way. So they are reflective of, patriarchal Christian society, with the caveat that very often female saints and the Holy Mother are a part of this.
So a few more questions. Rachel, any more specific comments on fembots? It would be something cultural about the creation of the ideal woman. I thought of this as there is a big current discussion about hyper-realistic female robots, including marriages and so on.
Yeah. I'm sorry. So speak more to that, or?
Yeah, I think, do you have any more specific comments about that manifestation?
Yes, the great text, the great novel is The Future Eve or Tomorrow's Eve, written by, my French pronunciation is terrible, Villiers-Liadam. Look up The New Eve or The Future Eve or Tomorrow's Eve.
Yeah,
it's a 19th century French novel. Edison is one of the characters, and it's sort of about the creation of the perfect woman, who also may or may not be animated by a female demon.
It's a great book. It's in the Decadent Reader, which is published by Zone, edited by Asti Hoodsfeld. I think we sell it on our web store. I'll put a link if we do.
And also I'm sure you can find a public domain version online too.
Absolutely. Okay, a few more questions. Altia says, so the dehumanization of the robot is something that began after the Second Industrial Revolution. Before, they were marvels made to imitate life, and after a horror. First, the marvels made to imitate life, and after a horror that imitates life.
Yeah, I mean, I think it also depends on who you're talking to. I certainly wouldn't disagree with that. I think that, they're so real now, right? So before, they were a part of, to quote Carolyn Walker Bynum, right? They were part of the species of wonder. And and as we get better at making them to do more things, that old horror about how do you control this thing certainly becomes a more real aspect of how we're living with them.
And that brings up what might be our final question. Oh, we have another that's popped up, but Will Linden asks, since we were talking about religion, what influence did the golem have?
Oh, and I didn't have time to talk about the golem. There's a great short essay called The Golem and the Robot, which actually kind of gets into this. It's important. I think it's important for Christians later. I don't know enough to know whether or not the golem is known to, obviously Jews are talking about it, but I don't know if these Christian engineers, these Christian alchemists know about it. I don't know. However, I do know that the golem is certainly important for the later Romantic writers. And I'm sure, the idea of the homunculus, we know that's a Renaissance concept. So I don't know how those two things are entangled. I can't really answer that. But certainly since the 19th century, the golem has been a huge part of. By the way, there's a beautiful restored upload of the Golem, the German film, available on YouTube. I just watched it for the first time in its entirety a few months ago. It's really good. Okay,
and so Kathleen asks, this might be our final question, did you find an uptick of automaton interest during the spiritual movement in the US, especially the New York region, when seances take off and spirit photographs, etc.?
Yeah, I think that's such a good question. And also, just to let you know, I'm also very passionate about all of that too. The spiritualism and the occult revival in 19th century United States. I don't know for sure. I know many of you on this call right now know this, that the intersection of spiritualism and technology is really, really fascinating and very rich. As it relates to automata, I can't really answer that. I don't really know. But I'm sure they dovetail in some interesting ways.
Okay, we do have one more question from Louis, who says, how big a part is the sexuality of the fembots in the passing of the Turing test when a male conducts it? Do you think females would be equally fooled?
What a great question. I can't really answer that because I'm not privy to the recent literature in philosophy, technology, or anything about the Turing test in relation to gender. So that is an excellent question and something I'd like to know more about myself.
Okay, well, I think that's a great one to end on. And I also want to say, I see a few people are talking about signing up for the class. I want to say, if you're a Patreon member for $5 a month, you get a significant discount on the class. So just take a look at that. And Jamie says he checked Gutenberg and does not have the book. Do check out the Decadent Reader. It also has a brilliant introduction that contextualizes in all of these things that Jason is talking about. I cannot more highly recommend the Decadent Reader. All the pieces are great, and the general introduction is fabulous as well.
Thank you so much, everyone. This was great, and it's been a long time since I've taught. It's the first time I've done it in front of a virtual audience, so thank you for your patience.
It was fabulous. Thank you so much, Jason. It was a fabulous and beautiful talk. You're getting a lot of love from the audience, including the word obrigado, which I assume has something to do with
yes, nada.
So everyone loved it. I think you'll be seeing some of these people in your future class. And thank you all for supporting our ability to produce these kinds of talks and classes. We couldn't do it without you, and we're very appreciative. We love to make a bridge between people doing interesting work and people wanting to do research into these areas. So thank you all for being a part of today's talk. Hope to see you again at a future talk. You're getting a lot of thank yous. Oh, thank you, Shane. Anyway, you just lots of rave reviews. So thank you so much, Jason. We hope to see you all again soon.
A great pleasure. Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone.